I'm Bob Crawford.
And I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now.
We are so excited to welcome Beth Lew-Williams, who is, I think, a recent Dan David Award winner. Welcome to the show, Beth.
Thank you.
I love the way that Bob says, I think. We know. We know. This is Dan David Prize winners make incredible guests on this show. So whenever we got hit up about doing some more episodes, we were like, yes, of course. If you guys who listen to the show remember, back in 2023, we actually had Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers on talking about women in slavery, and Anita Radini. Remember the conversation about the Archaeology of Dust, Bob?
It's the only one we've ever done with archaeology.
And it's just fascinating. And the thing that binds all these researchers together is they're taking innovative approaches to their research, really taking sources that, maybe the sources aren't new. In your case, they are, Beth. You did such insane amounts of research, but then applying new technologies to them. And I'm excited to talk to you today about what you've done, because I think it's something that a lot of historians could draw on, maybe to find out new things about their research.
So your book is Doe Chinaman, A Forgotten History of Chinese Life Under American Racial Law. So what drew you to this phrase, Doe Chinaman? And just give us a little bit of background. What led you to this topic?
Yeah, the phrase Doe Chinaman is something that I encountered in the archives. So for this book, what I did was I drove around California and Oregon and Washington and visited a lot of small town local archives, county archives, operating courthouses. And I was digging through legal records that documented Chinese life in the 19th century. And one of the things that struck me immediately looking for Chinese life, that is, their experiences, who they were, these individuals, is that I encountered, instead of names in the archive, lots and lots of, and I'm doing air quotes here, Chinamen. And it's really striking when you look at the sources. I mean, one of the things that I cite to get a sense of this is that California did a census in 1852, really early in statehood. And it found that there were more than 2,500 Chinese already in California, but it only listed about 24 of them by name. The rest were just Chinamen. And in legal records, often, sort of to recognize that this was an individual, not just Chinamen generally, they would call them Doe Chinaman, or sometimes when referring to women, Mary Chinaman. And it really just struck me that this term captures the anonymization of Chinese and really the dehumanization, that by not seeing them as individuals, not telling individual stories about them, not even bothering to really learn their names, that people at the time in the 19th century were erasing their individuality.
Just for our listeners and for background, talk about Chinese emigration to the United States in this period, and how it was mostly in the Western United States, not completely, but mostly in the Western United States.
Yeah, I'm happy to give sort of a background of what Chinese immigration constituted in the 19th century, because again, I think this is a history that we don't learn in school. I didn't learn it in K-12 education in California. I know that the students that enter my classroom at Princeton haven't learned much about this. The Chinese started coming to the United States in large numbers with the gold rush in California. We think of the 49ers. 80,000 prospectors sort of poured into California from the eastern United States, but also from Latin America, from Europe, and from China. And at first it was just a dribble, a couple hundred, but by 1852, 20,000 Chinese arrived in that year. And it was disproportionately Chinese men, working class people, people like the other prospectors, hoping to find opportunity, hoping to support their families. And Chinese immigration started there in California, and it really spread to other parts of the West. For decades, 99% of Chinese in the United States were on the West Coast. I think it's also important to note that Chinese were the first Asian group to come in large numbers to the United States. And so during this time period that I study, the late 19th century, the Asian population really is a Chinese population. And I think one more fact that really helps people sort of try to get into this history and how central it really is to the West is that during much of the time period that I study, the Chinese were actually the largest non-white group on the West Coast in these three states, California, Oregon, and Washington. And that starts to become the case in about the 1870s, when, unfortunately, the native population has dropped rapidly due to disease, dispossession, and violence. And at the time, Chinese made up about 10% of California's population, 20% of its workers. And it meant that there was like 100,000, almost 100,000 Chinese in California by 1880, but only about 5,000 Black people, under 100 Japanese people. So it gives you a sense of how central they are to this history.
So it's this formative moment. And I love talking about really the gold rush and how, most people don't go there and strike it rich. But it is this moment that after this wave kind of rolls back, it's created the United States' first foothold on the Pacific, first major port city. I mean, the gold rush is a year after the United States forces this land from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This is formative. And when you're looking at the transportation routes that people used to get there, there's no train from the eastern coast. So everyone's really coming in by ship, and it establishes this port. Now, I think most folks, and you really get at something here when I was reading this, just how liminal the Chinese populations are to the story, even though the story could not have happened without their work and without their contributions. But what is it about China itself? What are the push and pull factors about China that makes it the source of most immigration as opposed to other Asian countries or Latin American countries?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is about America acting in the world, right? I like to tell my students that America went to China before the Chinese came to America. And that's a lot of the story that Americans had been interested in the China trade. They want those Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, tea, things like that. And so they're already sending ships to China, and there's already an established sort of back and forth of trade in the early 19th century. And so that's how Chinese people, mostly in southeastern China, in Guangdong, get a sense of what America was. And that's how they hear about things like the gold rush. And the idea of America and opportunity there.
And how are they recruited? This to me is always the fascinating thing. Even when you look at early American colonization, it's like, how do you convince somebody to just up and move around the world? And what are the mechanisms for facilitating that transfer? Especially when most people who have resources are fine to stay where they are.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think that the one thing I'd like to be careful on is I think that recruited makes it sound like they're being imported. And really, this is an immigrant story, right? The Chinese are coming as individuals. They're not brought in as large, groups in some sort of concerted fashion. Instead, it tends to be not the poorest Chinese people, because they can't easily leave their villages, but sort of a step above the striving, hardworking immigrants that start out leaving their small villages in Guangdong, moving to cities, looking for opportunity. And when they can't find the opportunity there, crossing the Pacific Ocean, which is an amazing, next step to look for more opportunity. They often didn't have enough money to do so. So what they would do was they would borrow. They did this thing called the credit ticket system, where they would owe someone back their wages or their gold winnings if they got it, in order to cross the Pacific. And eventually, this was partially through American shipping lines, but it was also through Chinese merchants that really facilitated the trade of people. Of course, like I had said, for decades, they'd already been facilitating the trade of goods.
Yeah, and you think about this time period, and if you are Chinese and you're coming to the United States, you're aware of slavery. You're aware of the treatment of Irish immigrants and German immigrants. Surely you have heard of this, right? You've heard of this. The fact that they come willingly, chasing what we now call the American dream, it says something about the Chinese. So they come here and local laws begin to form around them, right? Illegal, they enter this untamed Western United States. And as the Western United States and the states they enter become more established, there's a legal framework set up around these Chinese immigrants. Talk about the beginnings of this legal framework.
Yeah, so when the Chinese arrived, at first they were just like every other prospector. Of course, there were, issues of communication, language. There was a sense that there was some racial difference, right? That they were recognized as not white, not European. But it took a couple of years before white Americans started sounding the alarm about the Chinese. And it was really one of the first California governors, Governor Bigler, who identified the Chinese as a potential racial threat, that they were a potential invasion into the West Coast. And a lot of the time when they're talking about the Chinese, they use the language of fear of slavery, fear, racial fears, invoking racial fears from the East Coast. That Chinese will be another form of slavery on the West Coast or another form of racial inferiority like Black people. And so the California, in order to try to control what they increasingly in the 1850s and then into the 1860s and 70s imagined to be a new racial menace, and they start to pass laws, laws at the state level, laws at the local level, trying to control these people that they see as strangers and potentially dangerous to the community. And that's really what this book is about. It's about trying to think about how Chinese were anonymized and sort of classified as this racial other, and then how they were controlled through laws and policing, incarceration, and then just everyday sort of racial norms about how people can interact. And what I do in the book is I try to document, historians had found before that there were a lot of laws that regulated the Chinese specifically that named them, laws that regulated their ability to work, their ability to form families, to get married, to attend school, to open businesses, all of these things. They had found that there were some laws that regulate the Chinese ability to do basic human things. What I wanted to do in my book was to try to find all of the laws on the West Coast that regulate the Chinese, to really get a sense of the scope of how their lives were being regulated. And I wanted to get a sense of what this meant for people's lives on an everyday basis. One of the things that really struck me going into this project was how much I didn't know. And I have already written another book on Chinese American history. I've spent a lot of time studying this, but I didn't know if a Chinese person walked into a restaurant, owned by a white person in California, what would happen? I didn't know if a Chinese person tried to rent an apartment in San Francisco outside of Chinatown, what would happen? And I didn't know to what extent these things were regulated by law or regulated by custom. And so this book was an attempt to sort of find out these really basic things about everyday life for Chinese people.
And your legwork combined with your methodology uncovered some pretty striking, just the numbers alone are striking. Could you talk about what you found with these laws and just how many there were?
Yeah, I mean, this was a great gift in that I started working with a student here at Princeton, an apostle who since has graduated, is an assistant professor at Duke, and is my collaborator. And she brought in the technological chops to do a project at a broader scale. So I was doing things the old-fashioned way. That is, I was like slowly going through state records, and I was looking at what every historian had ever documented in the past. I was looking at newspapers. But what she did, she had a radically different idea. She was like, well, what we need to do is find every single ordinance that was ever passed in as many municipalities as possible on the West Coast. Every ordinance. We need to digitize those. We need to make it so that the computer can read them. Then we just need to search. We need to search not just based on keywords, but use sort of machine learning assisted forms of search to try to find patterns. And we need to extract all of those laws from this data. In other words, we got to go big data.
Right.
Historians don't do this all that often. In fact, when I was speaking at a law school recently, the lawyers, law professors were like, wow, wait, we've never looked at local laws in this way. We only look at local laws if they make it into court, right? If they get challenged. Because most of these laws, lots of them are still handwritten on the West Coast. I'll point out that this plan became very challenging.
I was getting ready to say, anybody who's worked with handwritten documents knows what's coming.
Yes, because only, the state laws are printed, but local laws aren't printed. So anyhow, this was many years of trying to just build our data set, and then many years of trying to fine tune our ability to search. Hannah, like I said, did a lot of that technological work. And then at the end, I did a lot of reading because we don't trust the machines, right? We got to go back and see exactly what it did. And so I have now read a lot of laws. What we found was more than 5,000 laws that affected Chinese life, that tried to control Chinese life and marginalize Chinese people. And I do in this book a lot of work to try to um, be very precise about what I mean when I say more than 5,000 laws, social control laws that control Chinese lives, because I think there's different kinds of laws along the way. Some of these laws are, very specific and targeted at the Chinese. They say Chinese in them, or they say Chinatown, or they say Chinese fishermen, things like that. And some of these laws target the Chinese in more indirect ways. They target them in particular through their non-citizenship, their alienage. And the reason that lawmakers target the Chinese through their non-citizenship was because the Chinese were uniquely in the United States unable to become citizens. There was a naturalization law in 1790 that made it only possible for white people to naturalize in the United States, to become US citizens. During Reconstruction, Congress updated this law in 1870 and made it possible for white or Black people to naturalize and become US citizens. What this meant for the Chinese is that they, unlike other groups, white and Black, could not become US citizens. And so for lawmakers who wished to control Chinese populations, this was an opportunity to target the Chinese, not just through racial language, but also through targeting non-citizens and sometimes, but through targeting non-citizens or people, they would use the terminology aliens ineligible to citizenship. And so a good number of my laws are like that. And then there's also laws that regulate the Chinese even more subtly. They do things like regulate the use of opium, other than the use of opium by physicians. So they're going after what they think of as a Chinese habit, a Chinese practice. Or they regulate walking down the sidewalk, carrying baskets hung over your shoulders on a pole, right? In a traditional Chinese style. And this was a way to limit Chinese peddlers' ability to make a living, but to do so in a more subtle way. Or they do things like limit the use of firecrackers and fireworks not on federally recognized holidays like the 4th of July. And so I look at these group of laws that regulate the Chinese through their behavior. And then I look at, actually, in this 5,000 are also laws that don't have racial language, they don't have citizenship language, and they don't name behaviors that are only linked to the Chinese. These laws, I call them general outcast laws. A lot of people have talked about them as poor laws, but they're this larger group of laws, regulating vagrants, for example,
Yeah.
idleness. Yeah. And these, well, if you have a background in Jim Crow or anti-Black laws, these laws will feel very familiar. It's the way that Black people were often regulated in quote unquote racially neutral ways, uh, in an attempt to broaden how policing could happen.
Yeah, I think, and that actually the vagrancy laws, as I understand it, in California, began with attempts to regulate Native Americans. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. And I try in this book, although I focus on Chinese, to talk about the moments when there's overlap with other groups. And vagrancy laws is certainly. There's moments of overlap, but also difference. So
Yes.
some of the vagrancy laws that targeted Native people in California were very specific, and they say Indian in them. And they, instead of just being sort of, you may not be sort of idly vagrant in town, they also force Native children who are found to be vagrants into quote unquote apprenticeships. That
Yeah.
is sort of indenturing them, making them indentured servants. And that's a very particular history about, that affects Native people. For Chinese, vagrancy laws didn't have that apprenticeship portion. But there could be forced work that came out of these vagrancy laws for the Chinese because convict labor. So Chinese who are arrested were sometimes forced to work for local communities as convict laborers.
Yeah, this is for those of you guys who aren't familiar with the history of vagrancy laws. There's a deliberate there's an intentionality to it, which is if we don't find that you're working in some way that we think is actual work, we will force you to work for someone, and it tends to be the type of policy you pass in conditions of labor scarcity, where you have one dominant group who can use that seemingly neutral law to get what they want, which is labor that can't leave.
Yeah.
As you were saying all this, Beth, I thought of a book, Kate Masur, Masur,
Yeah.
Until Justice Be Done. She did a similar study of the vagrancy laws in relationship to blacks before the Civil War
Yeah.
and after and throughout civil rights. And it's basically the East Coast version of what you did, not with the methodology that you used, of course, because that's actually pretty groundbreaking what you and your colleague did. So there are all these, like, there's federal exclusion laws, and then there are state and local laws that really try to regulate daily life of these Chinese immigrants. How did they get around them?
That's a great question. Chinese people did all sorts of things to try to get around these laws. A great example is one of the earliest laws, the foreign miners tax. And so it sounds innocuous. And in fact, the long title of it is sort of to protect foreigners and define their liabilities, right, to protect them. And that what this law did was it said that a foreign miner, and later examples of the law said a foreign miner who has not declared their intent to become a citizen, uh, have to pay $4 a month to have the ability to mine in California. What this turned into was tax collectors sort of roaming the California gold fields looking for Chinese people because they knew these Chinese people were foreigners and ineligible to citizenship. The Chinese described this as law robbing because they would just set upon a Chinese camp and then just demand $4. They did not keep track of who had paid their tax and who had not. The receipts that we found just say, or they were just made out to Chinamen. And it allowed tax collectors to just sort of run rampant through much of California. What the Chinese did in response is, multifold, because this was really, it was violent. It affected people's ability to make a livelihood. And it made it possible that if the tax got high enough that it would drive Chinese out of the mines entirely. So what Chinese people did was a combination of things. Some Chinese elites tried to negotiate. They met with state lawmakers. They tried to explain this. They offered to send along translators to like walk alongside the tax collector with the idea that this would reduce the violence and the death that was happening. In addition to negotiating, sort of on the complete opposite side. Looking at court cases, I can find, physical resistance on the part of Chinese. Some people just saying like, I don't owe this tax and I will not pay it, and then getting into altercations with the tax collectors over this. There's one where the Chinese person is accused of biting someone's finger in an attempt to not pay the tax. Um, and then there's also, a completely different attempt by the Chinese to pay, to walk into these communities where they're already facing nativism and racism, and to sort of give their tax in advance, walk into the city hall and pay in advance with the hope that they would then sort of establish their right to be in this community and to belong in this community, to be included in some ways. The last sort of example, or I'll tell two more examples. One quick one is that they also use diplomacy, right? Unlike African Americans in the United States at this time, Chinese had a national government behind them in order that could advocate on their behalf. How effectual this was, varied. China was not a particularly powerful country during this time, but it did mean that there were diplomats and there were that could speak on behalf of Chinese, and they wrote to the Secretary of State and tried to argue against these discriminatory laws. Now, the last thing that Chinese did was they went to the courts. They fought these laws, and at times they won. Lots of times they won. They won in particular after Reconstruction began. After the 14th Amendment in 1868 stated that they had a right to equal protection and due process. And they used the Reconstruction amendments to say, hey, you can't, prohibit Chinese prostitutes specifically. You can't prohibit Chinese fishermen specifically. You cannot write a law saying that you need a license to be a laundryman and then only grant those licenses to white people. They used these, really the 14th Amendment in particular, but also the slew of civil rights acts that were passed in the wake of the Civil War, much like Black litigants did in the South, to fight for equal protection under the law.
So there are ways that the Chinese got around some of the legal constraints that dictated how they did business and how they made money and where they lived. What about getting around the restraints on their cultural life, right? On their social life? How did they get around those kinds of laws?
Yeah. Another example, I think, of a law that, it sounds race neutral on the surface, but it really was an attempt to go after the Chinese. These laws, they're known as lodging house laws or cubic air laws. And what they said in them is that every resident in a lodging house had to have 500 cubic feet of air in this lodging house. You got to have a lot of air to breathe. Okay. What that looks like, 500 cubic feet of air, unclear, right? I have trouble just picturing what that means. But what it meant in practice at the time was that police could raid a lodging house and walk in and see Chinese living in crowded quarters and say, aha, you don't have 500 cubic feet of air per resident, and then just mass arrest the Chinese. And it doesn't necessarily sound like a cultural practice, but it really was, right? Chinese were coming over almost entirely, it was men coming over. So they're living in these sort of entirely male boarding houses. And this is how they're making ends meet in a really difficult period. And so just the fact that they were all living together was the target of this law. One of the once they were sort of rounded up, and this started in San Francisco, although these laws spread across the Pacific coast. I started in San Francisco. What happened in San Francisco was that they were all rounded up, hundreds of them thrown into jail. Of course, in jail, they did not have 500 cubic air because they very quickly completely filled San Francisco's jails. And then what the law said was that either they had to pay a fine or they had to sit in jail. They could pick, right? Sort of, it was $10, something like that, or 10 days in jail. And the Chinese all decided to sit around in jail. I think that is partially because they didn't have the $10, but it was also, I think, an act of protest. When they filled up the jails, it made it so that the police could no longer raid and bring in more people, right? Because they just literally did not have room for the Chinese. And it made this law unenforceable. Unfortunately for the Chinese, a San Francisco supervisor, came up with a genius, but also malicious solution to this problem. He passed another law that targeted the Chinese by saying that all male prisoners who were in jails had to have their hair cut to within 1 inch of their head, right? So short hair. This target of only male prisoners was really a way to target the Chinese traditional hairstyle at the time. Chinese men wore their hair in a long braid, a queue, as a sign of fealty to the Qing court. And this was an important cultural marker. It also allowed them to go back home. If they were to return home without their queue, without this sign of fealty, they really would be outcasts in their native land. And so they really wanted to keep their hair. And so by forcibly cutting their hair, this forced the Chinese to pay the fine instead of sit around in jail.
There's this thing you said that immediately made me realize that I think mentally have been doing this, which is when we talk about the Chinese in the 19th century and the early 20th century, the word we use is exclusion. And that's the way we think about it. And all you have to do is say, they were excluded, yet they're the largest non-white group in California. So what does exclusion even mean? And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the problems you see that comes from focusing on exclusion as opposed to what you're talking about here, which is the phrase you use is conditional inclusion.
Yeah, just to make sure that your listeners have a sense of Chinese exclusion, because to me, this is the traditional story, but I think that, we don't all get this education. Uh, so in my first book, and in much of the field, we focus on, when you talk about a anti-Chinese law, usually what you're talking about is Chinese exclusion. These are federal immigration laws that started in 1875 with the Page Act targeting Chinese women, then 1882 targeting Chinese workers. These exclusion laws were some of the very first laws to bar immigrants from coming to the United States. And in this case, they barred immigrants based on their race and class. What it meant was the Chinese were excluded from the United States, from the 1880s into World War II. So a very long period of time where Chinese people were not allowed to come into the country. That is, most of them were not. But I worry that by telling this story, and I think we tell it again and again, the Chinese exclusion built American border control, that Chinese were not allowed into the country, we unfortunately are ignoring the fact that were already a lot of Chinese already in the country. The Chinese people continued to come during the period of Chinese exclusion. They came because there were exemptions for elites, merchants to come into the United States, students, to some extent, diplomats, so people continued to come. And then they also came as undocumented immigrants, unauthorized immigrants, despite the law. And what this means is on the West Coast, there's still 100,000 Chinese during this, post or during the Chinese exclusion era. And I'm worried that by saying simply the Chinese were excluded, we're not paying attention to that moment, sort of paying attention to that moment of border crossing. We're paying attention to the Chinese who did not come, but we're not paying attention to the everyday moments of people's lives within the country and the idea that they were regulated beyond that moment of border control.
how do the Chinese finally find acceptance, if that's the right word to use, in the United States?
I'm not sure I would go that far, to be honest. Yeah, and this reminds me
It,
that I didn't talk specifically about conditional inclusion. Let me talk about that.
okay, well, let me
Okay.
set this up better.
Okay.
And I'm not saying cut this out. I'm just saying, let me just, as I'm kind of like thinking through this, because here's what I'm thinking of, the moment we're in right now.
Hmm.
So you have mass deportations and people who are being excluded, like violently excluded from this country. But every time, but we also have we haven't been through this unprecedented moment, but in the 1870s and 80s, that was that unprecedented moment. Like, right? It was like a different unprecedented moment. And so we've been through this before, generally, where a group of people come to this country. There are barriers placed before them, legal and otherwise, to being citizens of this country. But eventually, they become citizens of this country. Eventually, they become citizens, and then another group is excluded or violently protested. So maybe it's not acceptance, but it is. Um, the Chinese Americans are an integral part of our society, and they're not the people that others are trying to exclude in 2025.
Yeah, I think to tell that story, we'd have to, go much farther than my book goes.
We have all day.
Okay, perfect. Because that's a very
I
complicated
pick up
story.
my kids from school at 4 o'clock.
Okay, sounds good. So, when the very beginning.
It's 9:45 in the Central Time, 10:45 Eastern right now, by
Yeah.
the way, for you guys who are listening.
um, there's a lot of things that happen in the mid 20th century that shifts immigration policy away from targeting Chinese and other Asian groups and sort of opens immigration. I mean, one of the things I try to get to convey is that Chinese exclusion, stunted generations of Chinese American families, right? My family actually came over in the 19th century, but most Chinese Americans today, their history in this country doesn't go back past 1965. And that's because in 1965, the United States passed an immigration law that did a comprehensive immigration reform and allowed for quotas of immigrants, including immigrants from China and other Asian nations. And they set up a preference system in which they preferred particular immigrants, immigrants that had family ties to the United States, but also immigrants that had particular skills that they wanted. So advanced education, things like that. So a lot of the history, the change in who are Asian Americans today, and what are their immigrant stories are really a post 1965 moment when we get this more highly educated, although not everyone, right? It was sort of bifurcated in the Asian community because we also get refugees coming out of the America's wars in Asia. So, we have this bifurcated, highly educated Asian immigrant population coming in after 1965, as well as refugees and more working class Asian immigrants. And I think that this shifts the perception of Asian immigrants in the United States. There's a whole lot of other things that also
Of
shift the
course.
perception of
Of course.
immigrants in the United States. A lot of it has to do with the civil rights movement and an attempt to make a more racially equal United States. And it comes out of, it also comes out of darker things, attempts to make arguments that Asian immigrants are sort of the model minority, the minority that shows that American dream is real, that there is equal opportunity, that if you just work hard enough, you can advance in American society. Um, and this model minority narrative is really also comes out. It comes out of the civil rights movement in some ways, but also comes out of a sort of an anti-Black undercurrent of sort of saying, well, if Asians can do this, why can't Black people and other people sort of pull themselves up by their own bootstraps? And so there's a lot of difference. There's a lot of change over time in how these groups are discussed. I'm
Okay,
not,
so
yeah.
I don't want to cut you off. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say you took this all the way up to the present.
Well, and I'm going to take it back.
Okay, go ahead.
Where was
Is
this
that
road
okay?
always leading, Beth? Where was it always leading?
Well, the road's now, Beth.
I mean, I'm happy to do. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean,
No,
so
because I think it's good for the listeners to connect these things and to see the bigger picture, even though we know it's complicated and we know history's not a linear line. It's an ocean, right? Deep and wide. So,
yeah.
but to take it back, I think
Do-
I can speak for myself that everything you just said, explaining where we are now and how complicated it is very helpful for me. Like I feel like I have a bigger picture, a sense of the bigger picture from where we began this conversation. Let's go back to the beginning and how were the strategies, how would you say the strategies used against Chinese Americans in the 19th century inform current racial and immigration policies? So let's connect the two.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of parallels, right?
Thank you for not saying, unfortunately, that's the stupidest question I've ever heard.
Unfortunately, it's overwhelming, the parallels, right? The the nativist rhetoric, the anti-immigrant rhetoric, it echoes in my ears because it sounds today so much like the 19th century. Fears of an immigrant outsider group, a criminal group, quote unquote, racialized as dirty, undesirable, as
Invasion.
invasion, undeserving, sucking out the resources of America, taking white Americans' jobs. All of this rhetoric was used against the Chinese in the 19th century and is very present in our everyday conversations today in a disturbing way. But it's not just rhetoric, and I think that that's important to note. Unfortunately, there's an even, stronger connection between these two historical moments. And that is that it is in the moment of Chinese immigration that the United States, invents border control, invents its mechanisms for keeping people out, and the moment when the Supreme Court weighs in on all of these things and establishes the rights of immigrants and in many cases the lack of rights of immigrants. And so, unfortunately, although Chinese exclusion is no longer with us, some of the Supreme Court rulings that really limit immigrants' abilities to fight for rights that are still, quote unquote, good law. They're still on the books.
One of the things that I feel like I've observed from modern rhetoric that connects to the past is this idea that like these people will come here, they're taking our jobs, but underlying it is the fact that like they come here to work. And because they come here to work, many of them with still an eye on the home country, right? With the idea that if you don't plan on moving back, you do plan on still maintaining connections and sending the money there. And then there's this idea that somehow they're coming in and taking jobs. But at the very base level, when you set up a regime that marginalizes a group of people, that prevents them from actually accumulating the types of material gains and social gains that other people have, by keeping them persistently marginalized, what you do is you make their labor less expensive. And I just wondered, to me right now, it's like we have this system where it's like, what a surprise. There's a lot of people here who are undocumented. Well, we've let them come here for so long. And when you keep people underpaid, right, you make sure they can't, people don't think about this. If you're paying Social Security, and this is a modern thing, on a false social security number, you're never getting that money back. You're paying into a system that other people are going to draw upon. If you don't have rights and you can't go to the courts, you can work somebody nonstop and never pay them overtime. You don't have to have insurance on them and things like this. And I wonder if that same type of stoking the fear while maintaining, right, this conditional inclusion you're talking about, with they're still here. I wonder if you see any parallels there as well with the populations you study.
Yeah, I think you're really captured that well. Um, I think that the Chinese, these local laws, what they were doing was they were not excluding Chinese. They weren't throwing them out of the country. They weren't trying to keep them out. They were trying to, really limit their lives, their ability to access government services, their ability to get, good jobs, to advance, to work in professions, to get an education. And they kept them in these marginal roles in society, just within Chinatown, just as laundrymen, just as quote unquote unskilled workers. And it made it difficult for Chinese people to fight they didn't join unions. They weren't allowed to join unions. They couldn't fight for their labor rights either. When you do that, when you sort of make a racial immigrant group into marginalized people, then you're keeping them sort of separate from society. You're denying them a form of belonging, and you're making them appear more expendable, right? That
Yeah.
they're not. An everyday part of American society, that they're not as well known, that they're strangers. I think that these things work together in really disconcerting ways. And one of the things I think is important is that I talk about sort of, yes, the Chinese were actually included in the United States. They were allowed to live here. They were allowed to work here, even during a period when there was exclusion laws trying to keep new Chinese immigrants from coming in. But they were included in this conditional way. And what I mean by that is that there were preconditions on their lives. They had to act in a certain way and accept certain realities in order to live in America and not encounter sort of constant policing or racial violence. Um, and they had to accept that they were going to have less access to economic opportunity. They had to accept that they were not going to be direct participants in democracy. They were never going to be able to vote. They weren't going to be able to serve on a jury. For years, they couldn't even testify in court against white people. They were going to have to accept that certain, cultural practices, as simple as, ringing a gong in a theater performance, was going to be regulated by local governments. I mean, they had to accept that there was residential segregation, that they couldn't live in particular areas of cities. I think, unfortunately, we're creating a similar circumstance for immigrants today. And some of these immigrants are Asian and Chinese. I'll just point that out. But many of them are not, right? They're from Latin America, they're from Mexico. And I think that the increase in immigration policing and coordination with local police is, again, it's establishing codes of conduct for undocumented people, some of them written in law, but a lot of them not, right? Norms. I talk to undocumented people today, and they're scared to do really basic things like walk around outdoors, like gather together and play soccer in the community park, because there's a sense of constant surveillance, whether it's true or not. And so they are actually starting to self-regulate themselves. And it's really very disturbing.
One of the things I can't understand about this is that this is driven by people who have power. And if we can compare the conditional inclusion that you talk about with Chinese Americans in the 19th and early 20th century, and we can find parallels with what's happened, right, with these recent immigration, right? Because it's fair to say that for the last few decades they haven't been excluded, whether or not they've come here with papers or without papers. It has been allowed, it's been permitted. Your book points out that this conditional inclusion benefited people with money. It benefited white Americans. It basically was, if you if you can strip the inhumanity out of it and look at it on spreadsheets, it's very good for people who could take advantage of these marginalized people for their mining operations, for their timber operations, for whatever they were doing. Many of those same people right now are trying to undermine this conditional inclusion and completely force exclusion. I don't understand it because it's been so very good for them. Any thoughts on that? Because it just seems like you're blowing up a thing that is not, I mean, it's not very cool. Somehow you're making it worse, but it seems like in its current condition, you're winning.
I know. I mean, so many people have benefited from the exploitation of immigrants, right? Today and back in the 19th century. I mean, California, one of the things that's really striking is that California was built on the backs of Chinese immigrants and on multiple ways, right? They provided the labor to, build the transcontinental railroad, to chop down those trees that were needed to build buildings, to drain swamplands, to build fruit orchards. Like really, they're building California, but they're also paying the taxes that were needed to build California. That foreign miners tax, that made up 10% of state revenue for California many years. One year, it made 25% of California's state revenue was Chinese miners paying their foreign miners taxes. And that's just the government. They're making money. It's that there's also all of these, capitalists, these entrepreneurs, the people that are making money off of railroads and agriculture and big placer mining. They're using Chinese labor. They're using these marginalized group to really make themselves wealthy and to develop the West. I think we see all of these things now, that these today's immigrants, whether authorized or not, are paying taxes. They are performing labor that we all need, and they're really propping up the American economy.
How did you get interested in this topic? Because obviously, you're doing work that nobody else is doing. You didn't just study it; you're invested in it. What drove you?
Oh, I think everything has multiple origin stories, right? One of my origin stories is deeply personal. That um, I'm multiracial, but my Chinese family has been here since the 19th century. And I grew up in California. I'd like to think we have a good public education system, but I came out of school not understanding really basic things about Chinese American history. And I grew up, my grandfather actually came to the United States in the 1930s as a 9-year-old. He arrived into San Francisco and he was held at Angel Island Immigration Station as a 9-year-old by himself without any parents for 34 days. And I knew him, at the end of his life. When he would, still talk about that experience of being in immigration detention. And at a moment, 70 years later, when he was still scared to talk about what that meant and whether, he was still insecure in his belonging in America. And I think that just having those conversations and not being able to tell him what had happened, he sort of saw this as a burden or a shame of himself that he had done something wrong, that he wasn't supposed to be here, that he didn't belong in America. I think a lot of my work is an attempt to explain to people the larger history that created those individual moments of feelings of shame and non-belonging. I'm also driven by the desire to tell a more, sort of broad and accurate history of the United States. And a broad and accurate history of the United States includes Chinese Americans. And I think that this is important even when we're talking about about race in America. We often talk in sort of black and white terms. People know much more about the regulation of Black people, about Jim Crow laws, about that history of segregation. And I think it's really important to sort of think more broadly about how race has operated in the United States. And a lot of that has to do with looking at the intersection of racism and nativism, and to try to explore that. What is the effect of sort of othering in multiple ways? I keep going back to the case of Chinese immigrants in the 19th century.
Amazing. Well, Beth Lew-Williams, it's so fantastic to have you. We're so happy you've got the Dan David Prize so that you can continue doing this work. The book is John Doe Chinaman, A Forgotten History of Chinese Life Under American Racial Law. Give it a read. It is certainly going to, the knowledge I've learned here is certainly going to make it into my U.S. history survey classes this semester, which I'm back at it and couldn't be happier. So thank you, Beth, so much.
Thank you for having me.
Beth.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS Channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Ben Sawyer, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.